Getting ready to take on your lawn? Make your first move with the reliable performance and power of Steel tools. From hedge trimmers and mowers to string trimmers and more, right now save on select gas tools starting at just $149.99. Real Steel. Find yours at steeldealers.com.
It's time to get inside the Giants Huddle.
Let's go, let's go, let's go.
On Giants.com.
I like it, I like it.
And the Giants mobile app.
Boom, give me some juice.
Part of the Giants Podcast Network.
Let's roll.
Welcome to another episode of the Giants Huddle podcast brought to you by Citizens, the official bank of the New York Football Giants. Thrilled to have the host of what I think is the preeminent NFL podcast out there, the Athletic Football Show, the one and only Robert Mays. Robert, how are you, man?
Doing well. Appreciate you having me. It's good to be back.
Yeah, it's good to have you. You were out here at Giants camp a few weeks ago. You had a chance to see this team up close. So I want to level set here first before we begin, because I got yelled at by Giant fans sometimes. They yell at me as a guy that makes excuses. And when I talk about the offensive line last year, I say, guys, it's not an excuse. It's a reason. And back in May, I went back just so I could refamiliarize myself. I rewatched all of Daniel Jones' dropbacks the first 6 games of the year, whatever it was. And I lived through that. I rewatched every game on Monday during the year. But when I went back and looked at it again, Robert, I was like, wow, that was worse than I even remembered it. I think there was a 60% pressure rate against Dallas in week 1. I mean, it was just off the charts bad. And this is the point you made, that there's a difference between bad offensive line play and what the Giants offensive line looked like last year.
There's no doubt. I mean, you have to get to a place where you at least have a functional NFL offense, and they couldn't get to that place. And you're right, it was from week 1. I mean, think about that starting offensive line in week 1. Andrew Thomas gets hurt at some point in that game. Mark Lewinsky is starting at right guard for you. He played, one more game the entire season before they decided, we can't do this anymore. Evan Neal obviously have massive struggles in that game, and those continued early in the season. And then by the time you get to week 2, Josh Zudu is your left tackle, and for the rest of the year, you're just scrambling for answers. And you can account for 1 weak point on the offensive line, maybe 2. You can do it with scheme, you can ship, you can help. When there are 4 guys at any given time who are just completely outmatched, it's hard to run an NFL offense. And for the most part, that was the state of this offensive line last year.
Yeah, and the way it affects, I think, the way you call your offense, right? Where you literally cannot call your plays. And the one thing that kind of shocked me when I rewatched it, how many times they tried the max protect with 7 or 8 guys, and the other team was still getting home with 4 on early down play action. That should be the only time, even if you're bad, you should be able to protect on 1st and 10 play action, max protect with 7 or 8, send 2 or 3 guys into the route against a 4-man rush. They couldn't even protect against that. I mean, what chance do you have?
And part of the problem is, if you're living in that world where you're only having 2 guys out in the route consistently, you're already just drawn dead. In this NFL, when it's all about, can you get 4 or 5 eligibles out? Can you make sure that you're attacking zones and defense, you're flooding them with the receivers, all that stuff. If you're only getting 2 guys out in routes consistently, it's already a hard way to live. You combine that with an inability to protect the quarterback, and you just see the foundation of it crumble. And that's why I'm curious about what it looks like this year, if we can get to a workable place, like a place where the offensive line and some other role players within the offense are just NFL caliber players. What can this offensive staff do? Because they had a really good year in 2022, and they had as bad of a year as you possibly could last year. What is the reality? I'm sure it lies somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, and I think it almost feels like the front office took the Daniel Jeremiah theory of offensive line play, was just avoid having the tomato cans, right? If you could avoid the guys that are just, you have to help a lot, you're going to be okay. So they bring in just a slew of veterans, right? John Runyon, Jermaine Illuminor, Greg Van Roten, Aaron Stinney, even, who started games for the Bucs last year. Just a bunch of guys that I think you know what they're doing. And then I think more importantly, they bring in a coach that coached 2 of those guys with the Raiders and elevated a group where you look at that offensive line last year, besides Colton Miller, they don't have guys that people are talking about as high-level starters, let alone Pro Bowlers. So I think they're trying this formula here. Well, look, if we can be the 21st best offensive line and stay out of that bottom quartile, this could be a huge win.
Be a miracle. If you're the 21st best offensive line in the league, considering what they were last year, that would be a massive, massive upgrade that, again, would just allow us to get some real information about what this staff is and what they want their offense to look like. You look back at 2022, it was a lot of the same sort of players for the Raiders and Carmen Brasillo when he was their offensive line coach. They ran the ball extremely well. I mean, that was an efficient offense in a lot of ways. It helps that you have Devontae Adams, and that changes the way the defenses play against you. But the hope is if you drop a guy like Malik Neighbors into what the Giants are doing, the entire ecosystem starts to come together in a way like we've seen in other places around the NFL.
Yeah, Giant fans, I want to stress, go check out, it was last week, Robert and Derek Klassen, his new host on the Athletic Football Show. Again, I always talk about it on our programming, the best football podcast out there. They do a great NFC East preview. They talk about all this. Go check that out. Find it on your podcast platforms, wherever you get your podcasts. So let's talk about what this offense is going to look like, Robert, because we know what Brian Daboll did in Buffalo. We all remember the first half of the playoff game where they didn't run the ball once. I think we all know Brian Daboll wants. He wants to throw the football. And I feel like even 2 years ago when the Giants made the playoffs, they had their, season that no one thought would happen. I almost feel like that wasn't what Brian Daboll wants to do, where you're putting an offense around Saquon Barkley. The quarterback run game is a huge part of it. I feel like he wants to throw the ball a lot more. And for the first time, I do think they've put together a group of players up front and at receiver where, look, this isn't, I'm not trying to tell you this is going to be Joe Burrow with Jamar Chase and T. Higgins, but I feel like they actually have a chance to run this offense the way I think Brian Daboll wants to run an offense.
I think that's fair. And I would wonder how much of that past happy life that they lived in Buffalo was a product of having Josh Allen.
It doesn't hurt.
Yeah, having like the second best player in the NFL throwing the ball 60 times a game and a guy who anytime he drops back, that can turn into your running game. Yep. They also ran a ton of RPOs. Like just the entire baseline of what they wanted to be in Buffalo, I think is an expression of the quarterback's ability. I don't think that they want to be what they were in 2022. I mean, that offense was hilarious to watch. I mean, it's just tons of rollouts and you're building the passing game through your running back. But I say that in jest. I was impressed by what they got out of it. Like it was a notably good coaching job. Like the man was the coach of the year. And I think that it was justifiable. Like he did such a good job of piecing that together. And that's why I'm at least curious to see what they can get out of this group. It's probably going to look a little bit more traditional, but I haven't just forgotten a lot of the flashes we saw from this staff doing a great job with the talent that they had in 2022. I think there are reasonable concerns about just the state of everything there, what happened with Wink Martindale, some of the things about Mike Kafka and just that relationship in general. But I still feel like there were enough flashes from that group during the early part of their tenure where at least I'm curious to see what the offense will look like when they get better players. And it seems like they have better players.
Yeah, look, and I think the centerpiece to all this, and I hate to put this on a rookie because I'm very much in the Bill Parcells school. Don't anoint the guy, don't give him a gold jacket, all that stuff. But look, I've been covering the Giants with the Giants since 2007. And keep in mind that Odell Beckham Jr. had a hamstring in training camp. So he's kind of pushed away. He's not involved in this conversation. Malik Neighbors is the best rookie I've ever seen in training camp. And frankly, it's not particularly close. I mean, he is really good. There's not much he can't do. He's had a couple of drops. That's the only thing you can point at and say, all right, I'm a little worried about that. But to me, if he can really be that number one wide receiver, that's the key for this whole thing really coming together for this offense.
You mentioned Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase. Yeah, they may not have T. Higgins. They might have Jamar Chase, though.
Right.
That might be what he is. And if that's the case, it changes the entire complexion of what you can be offensively. Think about the group that we're working with last year. Talk about the offensive line, but I mean, there are moments, like real moments, where Darius Slayton is your number one receiver. And Darius Slayton has a defined role within an NFL offense. We know what he is. We know what he can bring. But if that's the case, if that's the state of your passing game, that's not what you want to be in 2024. And the fact that now you can bring Neighbors in and beyond his talent alone, one of the things that I like about it is it allows everyone else to slot into the roles that make sense for them, right? You have Malik Neighbors is now your true number one receiver. We are building the passing game through this super dynamic talent. Wan'Dale now, you have your underneath option, your slot guy, who I think is very good in that role, honestly. I think unrealized potential because he really hasn't been allowed to kind of be the version of himself that he should be within the offense. And then you have Slayton and Hyatt as your burners. Like if you think about that combined with piecing together their tight end room, it makes sense. Like it's an NFL receiving room in a way that it just has not been over the last few years. Like they tried to make Darren Waller like the centerpiece of their passing game, and it just didn't work out for a whole variety of reasons. There's less ingenuity that's necessary here. Like this is something that you look at it makes sense to your brain, and it looks more like you want an NFL offense to look in the modern day.
You're ready for a change. Payday comes early with Citizens, so go to that retreat. New you moves to the country. Now you're raising goats and launching a lifestyle brand. Are you ready for all that life brings?
Yeah, they have the basketball team, right? They have guys that can
No
fill
doubt.
different roles and do different things. And I looked this up in preparation for this conversation because everyone talks about what's been going on around Daniel Jones. And we will get to the quarterback. That's obviously a huge part of all of this. We talk about the offensive line in front of Jones. If you look at the receiver group he's thrown to in his 5 years in the league, their leading receiver 4 out of the last 5 years was Darius Slayton. He's never had more than 751 receiving yards in a year.
Isaiah Hodgins was the number one in 2022. He was the best receiver on the team.
And Richie James. It was Isaiah Hodgins and Richie James. And we just got word from reports this morning that Isaiah Hodgins isn't going to make the roster this year. And when you're 4 of the last 5 years, you have Darius Slayton leading the team in receiving 4 times, never had more than 751 receiving yards. Kenny Golladay was the other guy. I mean, my gosh, if you can just get Neighbors playing to that level, and then to your point, you need Robinson and Hyatt, I think, to realize some of their potential. And I think that's kind of a theme for this whole Giants team, right? They have a lot of guys that they think can be good. They just haven't quite shown it yet.
Yeah, and I think that this draft too, beyond just Malik Neighbors, this needs to be a transformative draft for Joe Schoen and this regime. I mean, if you look at it, they just so desperately need an injection of talent at pretty much every single area of the roster, and you'd hope that this group can give it to you. If Neighbors is a guy, and then obviously use your second round pick on Brian Burns, that's fine. We'll take that. Hopefully he'll give you second round value, and then you get a little bit deeper. Like, can Theo Johnson give you a little bit of juice at tight end? Can Tyrone Tracy give you some pop in the backfield? What can Drew Phillips be for you? Like, if this group hits, I think it really does have a chance to kind of turn the ship for what this regime has done over the last couple of years. And based on some of the early returns from a couple of these guys, like, I don't think that's off the table at all.
Yeah, look, I'm with you. Let's stick on the offense here. Let's go to Daniel Jones. Obviously, he had a lot of issues last year, did not play well. There were reasons for that. Played better 2 years ago. But again, I think his good play had more to do with his ability in the run game than it was in the passing game. You look at his EPA per dropback, per pass, things like that. A lot of it was the run game. I really think, and I might be going too far this way, I know not many people agree with me, but I really think what Brian Daboll and Joe Schoen are going to do this year and say, Daniel, here's the ball, throw the ball. And you know what? If you look like you did your rookie year and you throw a few too many picks, but you're a little bit more aggressive, okay. I don't want to see that really low average depth of target. I'll take a few more picks if he's gunning the ball down the field. I'll live with that. So I think this is going to be, all right, Daniel, and Joe Schoen said this in a media availability. Look, you don't pay a quarterback $40 million a year to then hand the ball off to a $13 million running back. So I think, for better or worse, and we'll find out what the results are, I think they're going to really give him what's around him, know exactly what they have in Daniel Jones after this year.
I think it's part of the reason and part of the benefit of going out and getting a guy like Neighbors and doing what you did along the offensive line. It's like by the end of the year, I just want an answer. I want an answer on what the best path forward is with this team, because we know this. I mean, they can move on after this season, and that would put them in an unenviable position just because you'd have to go find a quarterback now, which is never an easy place to be. But you also can't pay a guy whatever his cap it is next year. It's like 50, 60 million, right? I mean, you can't do that for a guy who's not consistently lifting your offense. So I'm with you. I think one way or other, by the end of this season, they need an answer on what he is and what he's going to be.
What do you think is a successful season for Daniel Jones? I'm going to steal your closing question for all of your division preview teams. What is a successful season for Daniel Jones?
I think just keeping the job. I think keeping the job into 2025, like, he plays well enough where this group gets to the end of the year and says, could we move on? Sure. Is that going to benefit us? Like, is there really a better option out there for us than Daniel Jones heading into 2025? If he can play well enough and convince this group that the answer to that is no, I think that's a screaming success for him individually.
What does him playing well enough look like?
I think this is I try not to put a number on it. I think this is an offense that hovers around like a little below average, but it's one of those teams that I'll do it from my like very myopic viewpoint here. It's one of those teams where like in week 8, when we're doing our week 8 preview, I look at Derek, my co-host, and I was like, "You want to talk about the Giants offense? Like, we haven't talked about them at all. Like, it just feels like they're doing a lot of interesting stuff. Like, we should dig into this." That is to me like that's what it feels like. It's a team that's intriguing, that's a little bit better than you expect, that's trotting some stuff out that kind of like makes you sit up a little bit straighter in your chair, that surprises you a little bit. If that's the case, then I think that's about as good as you can hope for with this team this year.
I know we've kind of touched on it. What do you think this Brian Dable offense does in fact look like with different personnel that he's had the last couple of years?
I honestly don't know. Like that's one of the craziest parts about this. I wouldn't even pretend to guess. I spent 45 minutes of a training camp practice watching this team play this year because it was 95 degrees outside and 85% humidity, and I had a 5-hour drive to Boston. So I was like, peace, I'll see you guys later. But I truly don't know what to expect because, again, we've seen him be so many different things, even over the last 6 years since he got to Buffalo. They get to Buffalo in 2018, and I think a lot of that offense that year, just like a little history lesson, Pat DeMarco was on that roster. Like, this is a team that was rooted back then in a lot of those New England ideas, and that's where Brian Dable comes from. It was more traditional. And then I want to say going into the 2020 season, because people have told me the story multiple different times. That's when he kind of threw the whole playbook in the garbage and came into that spring and was like, we're just going to spread it out now. Like, we're going to be a spread offense with Josh Allen. And Cole Beasley was on that team, and they were literally stealing some of the spread concepts from his SMU days and like dropping them into that offense. And, Brian watches a ton of college football, and it was a lot of like, what RPOs can I steal from this college team these days? And then you get to what he was in 2022, and it's all under center play action, boots and QB run games. So that's why it's hard to pin down, just because you don't get that many hints about what it'll be from his DNA and even some of the stuff that he's been as a play caller, because that stuff is so disparate that it's kind of all over the place.
Yeah, I can tell you, I've talked to him, and when you ask him about what it's like calling plays again, he gets this little like grin and gleam in his eye where he's excited to do this, man. I think, when he first got here, you don't want to take on too much as a first-time head coach. You're just a coordinator before. You don't want to do everything. Now he's kind of figured that out, might be a little strong, but he's done it enough over the 2 years where I think he's ready to really mold this offense. And he has a guy like Mike Kafka who's going to have Andy Reid ideas to kind of help you with that sort of stuff, right? But I think he's really excited to kind of be like, all right, you know what? I've been here for 2 years. Year 3 for a head coach is big. I'm going down my way, and this is going to be a Brian Dable offense. And I'm excited about it. I think it's going to be fun.
Yeah, I think so too. I'm looking forward to what it is. I don't know what the end result is going to look like, but this isn't one of those teams where I'm walking into the season and I'm like, I don't know, man. I don't know how this is going to go. I think there are some offenses in the NFL where there's not proven success from the play caller, even if there is some questions about what the offensive personnel is going to look like. And at least with the Giants, you have a play caller and an offensive staff that has shown an ability, literally within the last 2 years, to get the most out of their personnel. So this personnel being improved, I think that you can reasonably kind of create a case for optimism about what this eventually looks like.
Football season is coming, and so is the next college semester. If you need funding, a Citizens student loan could help you pay for 100% of your school certified costs. Get your rate quote in about 2 minutes at citizensbank.com/pay-for-college. All right, Robert, let's go to the defense. And I know in the media nationally, everyone talks about the quarterback. They're all freaking out about the Giants offense. Based on our conversation, I feel much better about that side of the ball, quite honestly, than I do what we're going to talk about here on defense. And I want to start with the secondary. You were here. A lot of youth back there, right? The guy you're relying on is Deonte Banks. He's in his second year, right? Jason Pinnock's your veteran safety. He's like in his third year, and he's the guy that switched positions as a rookie. You're going to have Drew Phillips, a rookie slot. Cordell Flott's a third-year outside corner. You could be starting another rookie safety in Tyler Newman. Otherwise, it's a second-year guy in Dane Belton. This is an extremely young secondary in a Shane Bowen system that requires a lot of passing guys off in zone coverage, a lot of communication, things like that. So I think early in the year, if there's one thing to watch here, it's how quickly can this young secondary put things together and frankly just avoid giving up some of those back-breaking plays, week 1 Minnesota, Justin Jefferson, that can really kind of sink a game very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, there's tons of either unproven guys moving positions, or guys that we've never even seen play before. And it's not a great place to start. You hope it all comes together. You hope that Newman and Phillips end up being fines, but there are a ton of questions with that group heading into the year. There's no doubt about it.
How do you think in a Shane Bowen defensive system, which is much more of your typical NFL system these days, do you think you can cover up for some of the issues at corner, at least, when you run that type of defensive system?
Yes and no. I mean, they run a lot of quarters on early downs, or at least that's what he was doing with the Titans. So I mean, a lot of those situations do turn into one-on-ones on the outside,
man,
even if
right?
you're even if you're preventing explosives, hopefully on the second level, the third level of the defense. But even if you look at some of their third down coverage menus over the last few years, they play a lot of man coverage. Like, this isn't necessarily a system that hides those DBs to that extent. The safeties sometimes, maybe for the corner specifically, like I think that they're going to have their hands full in a way that you wouldn't really any NFL system. So I'm definitely curious to see what sort of step that Deonte Banks can take in year 2, because I think that's the biggest part of all of this. If he can be like a real guy, again, I think that makes you feel a little bit better, because the hierarchy of what your secondary looks like starts to shift, because whoever that number 2 outside corner is, be like, all right, he's our number 2 corner, like definitively. So that makes you just feel a little bit better about the entire complexion of the group.
Yeah, I'm curious to see how Deonte Banks looks in a different defensive system, right? They drafted him, maybe not for a system, but in his first year, he played in a system where he played a lot of press man. That's what he did in college. Big physical guy. That's what he was good at. This is much more eyes on the quarterback, a lot more off coverage. I'm curious to see how he adjusts to that different play style.
There's no doubt. And I think that that's a huge question when you have a guy with his selling point, right? The whole point is that he's a big, physical, explosive guy who fits a man heavy style defense. And so transitioning away from that, I think there are reasonable questions about how he's going to take to it. And, for a corner, we know that year 1 is always kind of a crapshoot. You have no idea how it's going to go. And going into year 2, switching systems, it's almost like he's doing his rookie year all over again in some ways. So I think it's a lot to put on a guy that they desperately need to click for this offense to come, or this defense to come together.
Yeah, and I think it's pretty obvious that the goal here, and we saw this in Hard Knocks, Shane Bowen talking about, look, he wants a pass rush that he can get home with 4. You don't have to, you can leave more guys in coverage to help the secondary. They're really going to rely on this defensive front to do a lot of the heavy lifting here, trying to get pressure on the quarterback.
No doubt. And I think that this defensive front is probably the strength of the entire roster when you look at all of the position groups individually. And Kayvon Thibodeau, I think that his sack numbers probably aren't in line with what he was doing down to down last year. But the hope is, now that you have 2 guys next to you who are people that offenses have to worry about, people that offenses have to game plan around, and Dexter Lawrence and Brian Burns, because can that make Kayvon Thibodeau's life easier? Can he take a step forward, and you look at pressure rates and just how often he's affecting the quarterback. And if that can happen, and you combine it with Dexter Lawrence, who I truly think is like one of the best 15 players in the NFL. Like, I just absolutely love Dexter Lawrence.
He's so much fun, man, to watch every day. Oh, he's
one of my favorite players to watch. And also, just when you think about how unique he is compared to every other player at that position in the league, and doing it at 330 and affecting the quarterback the way that he is consistently, he's a special player. So you have those 2 guys, and then you drop in Brian Burns, who, I think that Brian Burns never kind of got to that level I was hoping he would get, where he had those kind of like Von Miller flashes early in his career, but he is still a dynamic player. When you pair him with Thibodeau, with a Dexter Lawrence, I still think that this can be a group that's consistently making life hard for opposing offenses.
You love turf. You're good at it. So you start a turf biz. Business grows, your savings grow. Become the most celebrated name in turf. Are you ready for all that life brings?
Yeah, I want to dive in. One thing on Thibodeau, one thing on Burns. First on Thibodeau, and I've told Giant fans this. If you look at his pressure rate, his rookie year compared to last year, they're nearly identical. And you look at the sack difference, it went from, I think, 6 as a rookie to 11.5 last year. So I think the sacks, let's see how that goes. The evolution of Thibodeau as a pass rusher is interesting. He's been asked about this twice this offseason. I'm going to try to get him next week for a one-on-one to kind of dive into a little bit more. He asked how him and Brian Burns complement each other, right? And he's answered that question, that Burns is more of your twitchy, bendy speed guy. I'm like, yeah, makes sense. Then he says, I consider myself more of a length and power rusher, which I find interesting, because when you watched him coming out, that's not how I would define Kayvon Thibodeau and how he won at Oregon. So I think he's trying to evolve a little bit as a pass rusher. And, one of the criticisms of coming out that he didn't have the best bend to go with that outside speed and burst. So I think he's trying to maybe become more of a pocket pusher than become more of kind of like your outside speed guy, which is what I think all of us thought he was going to try and be coming out of college.
And I think that makes sense. I've really gotten to a place where I like to think about defensive lines just as complementary pieces stylistically, right? So like if you have a guy who's I was talking to a defense coordinator about this recently, just the idea of guys who are sack creators, even if they aren't sack getters.
Right.
So can you have guys within that group that are creating plays for other people? And a lot of those guys are the power guys. You know, DJ Reader was somebody that came up in that conversation where DJ Reader is pushing the pocket for that Lions team. Does that make life easier on Aiden Hutchinson? So if you have Thibodeau kind of crushing the pocket from one side, you have Dexter Lawrence crushing the pocket from the interior, what does that do for a speed guy like Brian Burns, whose path to the quarterback may change when you have those guys affecting the offensive line in the pocket in different ways? So I think it makes sense with Thibodeau potentially leaning into that when you have somebody on Burns who has the exact opposite skill set.
Yeah, and he has gotten a little bit better with his hand usage too. On Burns, I'm with you. When the Giants made that trade, I'm always one that hesitates. All right, well, you got to pay the guy and give up a draft pick. That's two sets of assets. I'm usually generally not a fan of that. But a pass rusher like that usually doesn't become available in free agency. That's why you have to make that sort of trade. And, you know, you look at his sack total. He's only broken double-digit sacks once in his career. His pressure rate is not up in the, you know, the TJ Watt, Micah Parson area. And then when I watched the tape again when he got here, and I'm like, oh, I remember why I thought this guy was phenomenal coming out in college 5 years ago. He's got every move in the bag, spins, long arm, power. He can win outside. And I wonder, when I take a look at some of the sack leaders and the pressure leaders over the years, a lot of them are on teams that are either good or at least average, right? And I think they get to play with leads a lot. And if you look at Brian Burns, he's been, frankly, on one of the teams that have been the worst in football the last 4 or 5 years. So I wonder if the Giants can actually get some leads this year, which is something they've been very poor at, by the way. I think they've been outscored worse in the first half than any other team the last 2 years. If they can get some leads, I think maybe Burns' production can pop a little bit more if he's not always playing from behind. And then obviously that changes the calculation for opposing offenses.
And just being in a defense with better pass rushers. You know, like Derek Brown is a really good run defender, but he's not the pass rusher that Dexter Lawrence is. And so I think just being around better players, you know, can be helpful there as well. And we'll see. With the Brian Burns thing, I think you're right. I mean, the Bears did the exact same thing with Montez Sweat, where you look at what the free agent market could potentially look like, and you say, you know what, I'm willing to pay a premium for this. The only question I have about that is that the right move at this stage in your franchise? Because you don't know what you're going to be paying the quarterback over the next couple of years. Like for a team like Chicago, it was easy to understand because we know we're getting back on that rookie quarterback contract. So I think for a team like the Giants, it's a little bit more muddled in terms of their long-term plan, how a guy like Brian Burns at that price fits in with everything else that you have. But I understand this front office looking at the landscape and just saying, we need to be better. I mean, we just need to be better in these spots because this is a really, really important year for us.
All right, final two questions here, Robin, and we really appreciate the time. This has been great. NFC East, I'm not sure the Giants are quite to the level where they could take advantage of it. But for the first time in years, I think I do see some vulnerability with Dallas and Philadelphia. You know, Dallas, they just re-signed CeeDee Lamb, but, you know, they have all their guys that are on the last year of their deals. They lost a ton of talent in the offseason. Just a lot of their depth is gone. And then Philly, frankly, collapsed at the end of last year. I know they have new coordinators and Nick Sirianni, you know, Super Bowl, all that stuff. I get it. But boy, that team did not look right at the end of last season. So I think I do see some vulnerabilities for the first time with those two teams at the top of the NFC East.
I think that's totally fair. With the Cowboys, I mean, they were already digging into the depth. Last year, you have the benefit of after Trayvon Diggs gets hurt, Deron Bland is a backup corner for you. He can step in and be a starter. Now, Deron Bland is a day one starter, and he's out for 6 to 8 weeks. So the season hasn't even started. It's August 27th, and you're already digging into that depth that you didn't have a couple of years ago, which I think that's really important to acknowledge. The same goes for their edge room. I mean, they had so many guys that they could throw out there last year, and now they're really going to be relying on like a Marshawn Nealon, who they drafted in the second round immediately because a lot of that depth has moved on. The same thing goes for the offense. I mean, now you have Jalen Tolbert that you need to be a contributor for you in the passing game. You're relying on 2 rookies along the offensive line. They've shown an ability to develop guys in those spots, but there are a lot more roster questions about the Cowboys at this stage of the calendar now than there have been over the last couple of years. Philly, there are very few roster questions. I mean, that team is absolutely loaded because of the way that they use their assets and the way that they spend money. The question is, what's everything else going to look like? Do you have the coaches on each side of the ball that can get the most out of that talent? Can you kind of pull out of that tailspin that you were in offensively by switching to a different scheme that potentially gives you a little bit more flexibility and some more answers? And I think that overall, like when you move on from 2 coordinators in a single offseason, the vibes aren't good. Like, that it's not, the building isn't thriving when those are the sorts of moves that you're having to make. And that's kind of my biggest pause with Philly is that I think they have talent. I think that the guys that are now running the offense and the defense, even if you may have your qualms about them, they've shown an ability to produce effective units in the NFL. I think it's more just, how do we feel about like the state of that building and what's going on with the head coach and all of the other different considerations there?
Real quick before we do a wrap-up question, the Giants. The Commanders, I could see this being a disaster. I got to be honest with you. Between their offensive line and secondary, didn't love Jaden Daniels, but in front of bad protection, I don't know. I know a lot of people behind the Commanders this year, man. I could see that going really sideways.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you look at the state of their offensive line, just the offense that they've run in the preseason, which I know you don't want to put too much credit in, but just like, okay, how afraid are you of the guys blocking like up front? Like the fact that he threw that goal ball in the first game and he got yelled at for it because they didn't want him to push the ball down the field. I think that they're just hyper aware of what they need to ask of him and potentially putting him in position that just keeps him safe through the entire season. And I have questions about the receiving core there. They traded Jahan Dotson. Now it's essentially just Terry McLaurin and, Zach Ertz and some unproven young guys. We'll see what happens with Cliff Kingsbury as an offensive coordinator again. But, I think this is a team that there are a lot of questions that I have heading into the year, and I don't know how bullish I am on what the answers will eventually be.
Finally, paint the rosy picture. What does a good Giants season look like to you?
Just consistently competitive. One of those teams that it feels like the floor is just higher than it was last year. I think that's the biggest difference is, they're going out there last year and they're just holding on for dear life to even field a functional NFL offense. Being a team again that's just the ideas are exciting, even if the players aren't necessarily all the way there. And we get to a place by the end of the season where it's like, all right, I can buy into this group. Like I can buy into this coaching staff. I can buy into this front office. This is heading back in a direction that Giants fans can feel good about. If that's the case, I don't think it matters if you win 7 games or 9 games. The number doesn't really matter. I think it's more about where the arrow is pointed by the time the season is over.
Yeah, I want to walk. The Giants are playing at Dallas on Thanksgiving. I want to walk into that game thinking, all right, this game matters for something. Be in the mix in some way, shape, or form. All right, Robert, before we say goodbye, tell the folks where they can find all your great content.
Anywhere you find your podcast, the Athletic Football Show, we do it 3 times a week. Right now, it's Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. When we get into the season, it'll be Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Our new co-host, Derek Klassen, started about 3-4 weeks ago. It's been really great to work with Derek. So, if you want league-wide NFL conversation and, hopefully, the depth that we can get to in something like this, then we'll hopefully be bringing that your way several times a week. So please come check it out.
We've had Derek on the show before. He's wonderful. Robert, thanks so much, man. Appreciate you joining us for the Giants Huddle podcast brought to you by Citizens. Everybody, thanks for being with us. We'll see you next time.
Getting ready to take on your lawn? Make your first move with the reliable performance and power of Steel tools. From hedge trimmers and mowers to string trimmers and more, right now save on select gas tools starting at just $149.99. Real Steel. Find yours at steeldealers.com.